Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Debra Rue, and this is Human Potential at Work. I am the CEO of Rue Global Impact. We recently changed our name from Rue Global Communications to Rue Global Impact because we really are all about turning up the volume for the people in the world that are really making a difference to make the world a better place. So that certainly fits right into the guest that I have today. I am welcoming Susan Scott Parker to the program today, and I'm going to have Susan tell you a little bit about herself, but Susan has been a mentor to me for many years, and Susan was she's a leader in the United Kingdom, but her work has really caused massive change, and she's accomplished so many things in her life. And if you haven't heard about her, I think you're going to enjoy listening to her. She's a very wise woman, and I think that she still has a lot of value to add to these conversations, including the legacy of all the work that she's done. But Susan, thank you for joining the program, and welcome to the program today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Susan, would you mind telling our guest a little bit about your background? And if you don't mind, really, going back to BDF and stuff like that, so that I'm sure a lot of people know about your work, but they might not know that you are actually the founder of a lot of the stuff that's happened and the global work that you've done.
Well, of course, I don't mind. Where to start is always the challenge with that kind of question. First to say I'm Canadian, and I came across to the UK for adventure quite a while ago. Stayed, obviously, and for various reasons found myself working with a group of companies associated with the Prince of Wales business in the community here. And we were looking at, and this is in the late 80s, why was it proving so difficult for the business community in the UK to even just meet their legal obligations under the quota? We had a World War II quota, which required them to recruit 3% of their population, the workforce. The outcome of that was very striking for me because it was clear that all the work that was being done to help people with disabilities to find jobs was really struggling because they failed to meet the needs of the employer. They were kind of stuck in sort of blaming the employer as the problem, ignoring them, and then wondering why they didn't recruit people. So I set out to try to create an organization which looked like this. It was a group of companies joint funding a small expert team that would make it easier for them as employers to get this right. And in particular, make it easier for business leaders to meet people with disabilities as leaders and change makers in their community. Because without that, everybody gets kind of stuck. So I set up the first business disability network. We launched with Prince Charles in 1990. And I remember it so well because the party hosted by one of the big hotels cost more than we had in the bank. A social enterprise launch that you can definitely relate to, I know.
Oh, yes.
And so we launched something that said, we need to understand what gets in the way when the well-intentioned company is trying to get this right, and then systematically provide the tools, the insights, the connections that would make it easier, on the grounds that if we couldn't make it easier for the well-intentioned employers, well, the rest were going to pretty well stay where they were. In the course of that, we launched the first corporate disability standard to measure the performance of the entire business, challenging the assumption that somehow HR could magically transform the behavior of the IT guys and the facilities guys and the procurement guys. And one initiative that I think really demonstrated how we worked is I launched the first technology task force, which brought chief technology officers and chief information officers together to say, given the impact you have on the business, how could you ensure that you deploy technology in a way which liberates everyone's contribution instead of knocking them out? And so this business-to-business problem-solving model, informed by people with disabilities as experts and specialist advisors, it's made a huge difference. And one of my frustrations internationally, I guess, is that all that work is up there online, and many of the companies you work with in America probably don't know There's a maturity model up there that has been tested by companies like Shell and Barclays and KPMG, and God, the list goes on, which any company, big or small, can use to measure its performance across the business in terms of how ensuring that the technology that permeates our lives now enables everybody's contribution. And then I got involved in doing things like helping to set up similar organizations in Australia, the outstanding work that Suzanne Colbert has done with that Australian network, helping to set one up in Sri Lanka, where the companies there, I can remember one gentleman standing up at a session we were doing with the government of Sri Lanka, and he said, well, this is a small island. I really need good people. If you're telling me there are disabled people out there that could work for my tea plantation, I'll take them. And the government person stood up and said, well, actually, they don't want to work.
Ooh, that's not good.
But what happened is, then they started as business leaders to meet people with disabilities locally. Everything changed.
Right,
and
right.
They've made a huge difference. And then working with the Austrian Business Disability Network, led by the extraordinary social entrepreneur Gregor Demblin, that has for the first time brought a group of companies together in the German-speaking region, prepared to, in effect, try to ignore the negative impact of the quotas that were invented in Germany, as you probably know, for soldiers coming back from World War I. This is 100 years that dysfunctional framework has been operational there. But Gregor has brought some companies together determined to look at best practice, not legal compliance. They're setting up the first internship program for disabled graduates in Germany. Some really exciting stuff.
I agree. There's so many exciting things happening. And a lot of it we've just built upon. And as you said, a lot of this stuff we know doesn't work, and yet we keep doing it. And I know that drives you crazy, especially watching it from across the pond. And that's why often on this show, I'm inviting leaders from the UK to talk about what they've done in the EU and others. And because we really don't have to start from scratch. There are already successes that we can build upon. And yes, the United States is very legislation happy, but still, I think most corporations just want to do a better job of inclusion across the board. And it's just interesting watching things shift and move. And I know something that's always been a pet peeve with you. I've heard you talk about this, complain about it for years. And it's
say the same thing over and over. Is that
well, you get sick of it. Well, no, but this particular one is you have always felt, and I remember, to be honest, you were the first person that said this to me, and I thought, I really thought about it, and I thought, boy, she's right. So you're thinking, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is you really don't think that the way to solve the problems of true inclusion, true employment for people with disabilities is by only having diversity and inclusion in the conversation. You think that unfortunately, the diversity and inclusion part of the organizations, they don't have any money, they don't have any resources, they often don't have real voices to be able to make real change in these organizations. And I remember when you first started saying that, I remember really thinking about that and trying to ground it in my own mind. And I found, as I really explored that you, I totally agree with you. And I know that you have been involved in some of the efforts I've been involved in, like the International Labor Organization's Global Business Disability Network. You're an advisor to them, as I am. And you have been saying that in that arena as well. It's not that we don't want diversity and inclusion people in these conversations. We do, but it's got to be broader. And if you're truly just going to put it in their hands, then give them the money, the resources, the ability to really make changes for the corporation. Don't just make it a check mark, which often is what we see happening. So I want to let you come in here.
Well, I think there's two things that come to mind. I think when it comes to persuading a company that treating people differently, i.e. making adjustments or accommodations, we do this to treat them fairly. It's not special treatment, and we don't just do it because of a legal obligation. So, I'm only going to treat you properly if I have to. What is that? we jumped from not under, we didn't first make it deliver equality. We didn't address the equality agenda before we jumped to diversity. And so equality means that your facilities managers, don't lock the door at the top of the ramp, that you've got the built environment in a state where it does adapt as someone becomes disabled while working for you. And the IT people don't buy Taleo, notoriously inaccessible in terms of online recruitment. And so I just think that it was unfair to expect the diversity and inclusion profession to suddenly be expected to pick this up, because the real challenge here is, how do you remove obstacles for disabled customers? Typically, diversity managers have very little power over what the CIO has decided to do on his digitalization strategy, which has left every customer over the age of 50 struggling to get through their website. and they absolutely have no authority over the property people who rent a building in Ghana that none of their disabled colleagues in London can work in. And so they've lost that mobile workforce. And they have no power over what the board does when it looks at what they measure in terms of their performance. They should be measuring how quickly do we deliver adjustments and accommodations, which require IT and property and procurement and everybody in the game. Instead, I fear many diversity managers experience the sense of frustration that they are somehow expected to hold this issue as theirs, but not given the authority, the budgets, the power to actually drive it. And I've just been writing a piece actually on this problem we've got with the C-suite, where you've got CFOs and CMOs and all these other Cs, but there is no chief productivity officer. So there isn't actually anyone in the business who cares that this woman, for a huge pharmaceutical, has been waiting 18 months for someone to change the light bulb because it gives her migraines. And so whose job is that? Is that the property people? Is it HR? Is it Doc Health? And the contract didn't specify how quickly they were supposed to change the light bulb, and who was going to pay for the light bulb. And so she keeps going home with her migraines, and eventually she'll walk. But in this particular instance, it had been 18 months and they still hadn't changed the light bulb. So we actually have a structural problem inside these large corporates, which I'm hoping now, as they are increasingly getting the message from people like Caroline Casey and valuable.
Yes, love Caroline.
About business. This is about where the interests of business and the interests and aspirations of disabled people coincide.
I agree. And let's talk about Caroline for a minute. We both know that, both love Dr. Caroline Casey of the Valuable 500. And she successfully, after 30 years, got disability inclusion on the Davos stage, the World Economic Forum stage. And she was up there with some of the best known CEOs in the world. It was funny to watch, because those of us that know Caroline knew darn well she could do it, but everybody was like, she can't do that. Nobody's able to do that. Well, just give it to somebody that, as soon as you tell me it can't be done, I'm going to go find a way to do it. So I'm very proud to be one of the U.S. representatives of Valuable 500, and I know you've been very engaged in what they're doing. And tell us more from your perspective about Valuable 500, because getting disability inclusion on the boardroom agenda, I especially if we get it on the boardroom agenda and it really has impact. I don't want you, just because I see this often, and there's one that I won't say who it is, but this one group of very well-intentioned people got together as corporations and signed this thing agreeing to all the stuff and then never did anything. So we often are a little nervous in the community when people are just going to sign something, because that doesn't mean anything if you're actually not going to do anything about it. So,
well, it does mean something in the sense that they have raised their profile so that people like you and your viewers can start sending out little messages saying, so what do you do now? What are you doing?
I agree. Well said.
Be realistic here. Having spent 30 years enabling business leaders to get to the point where they were prepared to publicly commit to do things, I know that no matter how many enabling products and services, no matter how many irresistible training programs I put together, speaker packs, ultimately I cannot control what they do. All we can do is make it easier for the enlightened business leader to do it than not. And so much now will hinge on the supportive environment around them, where they see that actually they're not going to be attacked because there isn't some kind of miraculous improvement in their performance, which no one could measure anyway, right? The companies that are doing best on disability were with me in 1990. This is a long haul because we're changing the way people see the world. A lot of people, not just these employers, because don't forget, when this business leader goes home, she is surrounded by people who have the same attitudes and assumptions that she does. It's not as though this business leader goes home and gets beaten up by all their neighbors and friends because they have some outdated view of disability. We're part of a much broader ecosystem of attitudes and assumptions that is still stuck in all that medical stuff, stuck in legal compliance stuff, rather than saying, actually, this is about 3 areas of human endeavor. We need people to be able to earn their livelihoods, gain respect, dignity, and just get out there. And that there is no conflict with what business wants. Business needs to attract talent and recruit on the basis of capability. Many don't know how to do that. Well, why don't you learn with this guy with cerebral palsy who could be a film producer if you just were clever? They need to enhance the productivity and engagement of their workforce. And they need to make it easier for people to spend money and enjoy it while they spend money. All of those things are where the interests and aspirations of disabled people in the business absolutely coincide. So one of the outcomes I'm hoping from the Valuable 500 is that we encourage these senior business leaders to now reach out and encourage conversations with people with disabilities in every country in which they operate. If they did nothing but measure their performance in Spain and Uganda and China by how many people with disabilities did my people engage in productive and interesting conversations, informal, formal, work experience, advisory groups, parties with a purpose where we bring people in. If they're talking to more disabled people next year, it's starting to work. Right. And so then that's where, when I'm talking to a company in China who says we've got a really powerful women's network, but we're not quite sure where to start on disability, I say, introduce some very interesting disabled women to your women's network. Have a conversation about what's the impact of disability on women in India, non-disabled women who aren't working with you because they have caring responsibilities. And if you helped them to sort that, they would be with you alongside contributing to the bottom line. And of course, the impact on disabled women and girls. And so Deloitte are launching in India an initiative to empower 10 million women. And so we're now talking to them about making sure disabled women and girls are part of that. Now, that's the kind of reaction that we need from our allies in the disability sector, is you don't say, yeah, so I don't suppose you got disabled women. You say, how could we help you get disabled women into that? How could we make it easier? Can we make the
Yes, and I'm working on a Women in Tech task force for the United States. And the first thing I said, well, if we're going to make this successful and we're going to make this as something that we would want to be a good model, we have to have diverse women here in these conversations. We also, I see right now, and by the way, not only do we need very diverse women speaking for themselves, we also need our male allies in here as well. And the groups that are not including the men, I think, are making some of the same mistakes the men made. And so I think it's very important in that we all have a stake in this, but this is really about diversity in its true form. So one thing that I continue to see, though, in all over the world, but certainly in the United States, is these groups sort of attacking each other. So it's like the women's group. There was the very vocal group where some of the women were attacking other women, and these women happen to be Jewish, and then the African American. And I think that's the worst thing that we can do with our movements is start attacking each other and not including each other, or I don't want to hear your voice, because we really need to continue to learn from what we already know. And I think that's why a lot of the work that you do is so valuable. And I also know that that's why it's so important for leaders like Dr. Caroline Casey to be involved in these conversations. And it's interesting watching how we do these things in the United States, because I work with a lot of multinational corporations, and right now most of them are U.S. based corporations. That hasn't always been the case, but I think there's a lot of reasons why that is the case now, just politically and just the landscape around the world and all of the disruption that's happening and transformation that's happening. So I think, projects like the Valuable 500 can add great value to these conversations. I also know that you created another organization called BDI, and you created it with the sponsorship and support of GSK, Barclays, and Infosystem. So maybe you could just tell the audience a little bit about that effort.
I'd be happy to. Can I just come back very quickly on what you said about the infighting that you observed?
Yeah.
From the business perspective, they see a completely mysterious maze of agencies and public bodies and governments that sit between them and disabled people.
Right.
And so the more infighting and the more chaotic it looks, the harder it is to bring the business community to the table. It's just a fact.
And I just want to say I so agree. And I remember one time I was invited to the White House. It wasn't really the White House. It was the executive offices behind the White House, but I was invited to the White House. And yeah, and I was invited. There were about 6 other leaders that were invited as well, and the leaders were representing different parts of the disability community. I was there sort of overall, but but there were people representing the deaf community, the blind community, the mobility. Anyway, it was just a small group of people, and the government at the time, the United States government leaders were asking the disability community via this meeting to tell us what we needed. What do you need? What do you need from the government? And so it was, at first it was okay, and then it very quickly got into infighting, and it's like, well, the deaf, we need this, but the blind, we need, and I'm not even using people first language, but the infighting started right in the room. And the 2 executives that had invited us, one of them pushed his chair back and he said, well, we have a lot to do in this new administration. And he said, we're listening to the Hispanic community, the Asian community, the African American community, the LGBT, and they said, sounds to me like the disability community needs to get together and decide what y'all want to work on together. And once you know, come back and let us know. And I was just so ashamed that that's what was happening, because we had this wonderful opportunity. We are the leaders supporting all of the community of people with disabilities in the United States, and this is the behavior that is being displayed. And it made me very sad. But anyway, I continue to contribute to the conversation to help, but the infighting hurts, and the corporations get so scared about the infighting, and it just makes them want to move away from us. So that was a very good point. Thank you.
And actually, from the perspective of a business, we're looking for allies who can help us to attract the right people at the right time, get the support our managers need, help us in practical terms, figure out why on earth these customers can't access that particular mortgage application. We're looking for practical help, grounded in the understanding that we are valuable service users. We are valuable stakeholders. Just calling us the problem is too easy, and it's a dead end.
I agree.
We're asking about Business Disability International.
Yes.
Over the years, as we were working with so many multinationals headquartered in London who were members of the UK network, time and time again, we would hear, well, we can't fix the website. It's controlled out of New York. And well, that contact center is in Singapore. And our global facilities management contract was signed by the guys in Zurich, and we can't influence it. And so Barclays, GSK, and Infosys came together as founders to underwrite, if you like, the startup of what is just a very small team of people whose job is to help key players in the system understand how you meet the needs of business so that you meet the needs of disabled people, to make the shift that's necessary if you're a public policy maker, for example, to endlessly fund NGOs in Kenya to just focus on helping individuals while ignoring the employer and then wondering why they don't get jobs, or funding, I can remember a school for deaf children. And on my tour, I'm shown a workshop where they're getting vocational training and they're learning woodworking. And I say, are there lots of woodworking jobs? And they say, no, but this is what deaf kids do, right? And so
No, they don't.
I'm working with a global bank now to help them look at their strategies so that they require the NGOs they sponsor to meet the needs of employers as a condition of getting employment empowerment related funding.
Yes,
Just being more clear that you need, when you give money to agencies, to have a better picture of what they need to know and do if you're likely to get different results than you got last year. And so I'm working with the Canadian government, who with the new legislation coming through are looking at their own performance. How do they measure the performance of every building across Canada, from an airport through to an office to a small place in the north? I'm working with the German equivalent to USAID, GIZ, their strategy, as I say, with the bank. It's really interesting because every day is completely and utterly different.
Right.
But it helps us to see where the gaps are. And that's why I'm so focused now on two particular areas. One is there isn't anyone tasked with enhancing the profitability by enhancing productivity. And if you look at any large company, I defy you to find someone other than maybe a COO who's taken it on, not had it given to him, who is saying, why are people waiting 6 months to get some basic tools that they require? How can that be? But the second thing, of course, is endlessly coming back to technology. We're starting to look very closely at the impact of AI-powered recruitment screening tools. Now, a lot of work in terms of the future of work is being done on what jobs are going to disappear, and you have floating elites and all this. Very little attention has been paid to this just booming marketplace where organizations are setting themselves up to make it easier for an HR recruitment department to manage the fact that the technology now enables thousands of people to apply for a job. So their primary task becomes to discard as many as possible as cheaply as possible.
Right.
And so we're looking at particular models that are coming through. You saw, I think it was Amazon that announced that they were ditching an AI screening tool they developed because it was looking at CVs, and it looked at thousands of successful CVs and then went to find CVs that matched the successful ones to discover that historically most of the successful CVs had a man attached to them. And maybe they didn't really mean to automatically discard anyone who used the word woman in her CV, even if by mistake it was in her volunteer work with the local women's group. And so the AI was knocking them out. But what I've been looking at in particular are these programs where a company will nominate someone as an ideal hire. This is a really good employee, Harry on the 6th floor. And then your machine learning microanalyzes Harry, all his nonverbal expressions, his voice tone, his eye contact, the way he smiles, the way he looks up when he thinks cleverly, his nonverbals that are visible to the camera. And then they interview, and one company is just celebrating 9 million such interviews. And they throw out everyone who doesn't look like Harry.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that, of course, is that there are a lot of people with disabilities who don't look like Harry. One problem is the database they use are people who are in work. And, anywhere around the world, 2 to 3 times as likely to be not in work if you're disabled. But it's more than just bias. And too much of the debate around this has been focused on this little word. It's about unfair treatment that is delivered by the way the whole thing works. So yes, you might get the bias in the database, but then they are proud of the fact that they eliminate human bias by having standard questions for everybody. So standard questions for non-standard applicants are almost inherently discriminatory. And then, of course, the system has no idea how the AI could possibly say this candidate is the best candidate, but it depends on the employer making the adjustment, letting him use JAWS when he comes in. So how on earth are they going to factor that in? So we're bringing a group of thought leaders together, IBM, taking a real lead with us on this because, of course, they want to be the best in class on anything to do with AI. So help us solve this one is the challenge for people in. And one of the world's biggest law firms, Simmons & Simmons, is going to be hosting a roundtable where we're looking at people who buy it. Are they ultimately responsible if it's unfair treatment? Looking at the AI ethical responsibility domain, bringing influencers in there, is going to be very interesting, and it's hugely important because it's not just going to knock out people with disabilities. It's going to knock out people who are not like Harry.
Right, like women. Right, because I know that I had a gentleman, Rob Newhauser, on the show. He's a president of Siemens in Germany a few weeks ago, and we were talking about unconscious bias and that they have 5 generations working in their workforce of 375,000 employees, and how they started doing this unconscious bias training, and they changed the way they were doing the interviews in HR, and they found that by these changes, they had hired 50% more women engineers, and they were really surprised that these changes allowed that diversity to happen. They were delighted by that as well. And then, of course, you can from there, of course, go into the other groups that aren't being included. So
what I find fascinating, having watched the flavor of the decade around unconscious bias training for a long time, is that usually it makes no reference to people with disabilities whatsoever. Because I think the unconscious bias about people with disabilities is so deeply unconscious that even the guys that do unconscious bias, they miss it.
Yeah, now I know that at Siemens, they did include that.
Okay.
They did. And so they had, they included all the different, there's so many different groups, right? But it's very interesting. Siemens seems very innovative, continues to be very innovative. So it was interesting, and it will be interesting to get more results about the other diversity group. I thought it was very interesting about the women engineers. So I'm looking forward to learning more about what they're doing. But this is a competitive advantage to them as well. So they don't really need to tell everybody what they're doing because, they're getting the talent. So that's, it's always interesting dealing with business. But Susan, I want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with procurement, because I know you and I have always agreed on this topic. If we can solve some of these problems at procurement, and I've always told my customers that in the United States, especially where they were concerned about litigation, solve it at the procurement, start there at the procurement, because once it goes into, the contract, and if somebody comes later and says your website's not accessible or this software you build isn't accessible, and this was something that you used a vendor, you have, the avenue to go back to them and say, what, blah, blah, blah. So I've always felt it was very important to deal with that at procurement, but still there is so much work to do with this. It's still, I don't know why, because it's not that hard to do. Even if you add it in the contract, I used to tell the US government that, even if you add it in the contract, but you don't really know how to really determine whether or not the vendor's doing it, if anyone ever complains, you have this contract, which is part of our FAR, that you have a much more recourse than if you did not include it in the contract. So it to me, it was just common sense, and yet we're still not doing it.
Well, I think one of the issues here is almost just a failure to communicate, because when I talk to procurement people, they assume we're talking about how you procure accessible glasses. It's about products. And even then, the word accessible for them triggers ramps, and they don't buy ramps, and so that's the end of that. So what we've been working on is we're saying that the first priority for any procurement professional is to look at the suppliers that get in the way when you're trying to deliver best practice as an employer and as a service provider to your customers. And so we started up our Global Procurement Task Force, which is co-chaired by the Chief Procurement Officer for Infosys, and a very senior procurement professional at EDF Energy, headquartered in Paris, to say, we've got 3 or 4 main priorities in the first instance. IT is high on the list, of course. IT is a service provider. So why is it when you call your helpline and say, I'm really struggling to see this screen, they don't know what to do? And what happens when you're trying to buy in software or hardware and you don't know what questions to ask? The second thing, though, is your facilities management contracts. Almost every time you see a substantial delay in adapting the environment so that someone can do their work well, facilities management is saying it's not in the contract. Or, my story about that light bulb taking 18 months, that's an FM thing. And there's nothing in the contract. And it ditto on the customer experience, staff training, or when, one of our big food retailer empires rolled out those terrible self-checkout things, which I loathe. They outsourced, the contract from market research to some researchers who failed to ask, how does this work for disabled and older customers? So even the fact that they've got older customers that can't read the controls properly and whose hands hurt when they try to do that and can't find that, they omitted any reference to that in the tendering process. So it's when the procurement people see that actually they can have a direct impact on the performance of the business as they're bringing people in, enabling productivity and serving their customers. And you start there and you make it real. And so we have launched, with some help from G3 ICT, James Thurston so well, we have launched this IT tender tool. It's now being piloted by our nuclear energy guys, by the Canadian government, Virgin Media. It's a simple set of questions, 10 or 11 or something, when you buy software, and a few questions when you buy hardware, to say, we just want to start a new conversation, because in procurement, I'm not going to ask you to meet 300 pages of standards from the European Union, because I don't start there. Procurement have only got so much space in this. But if I ask these 10 questions, and if you do meet those technical standards, great. But just talk me through why you're telling me it doesn't work on that one and it doesn't work on that one. And could we work together to make sure that if I do buy this, it works within 6 months? And so it's very practical things like that. But I think also people underestimate the power of procurement in this domain.
I agree. And I think it's a mistake.
Yeah, and they underestimate the complexity that these big companies are managing. In terms of the facilities, I was talking to one company based headquartered in, I think in the States, big office here, and they have a contract with the FM provider for about 20 countries in Europe that goes to a central hub, and then they outsource to 15 different providers. So you've got global, regional, local contracts, the whole cascade. And I bet when a disabled colleague says, why don't you fill the soap dispenser that you've finally moved next to my sink so that I can reach it from my wheelchair? And they say it's not in the contract. We're trying to figure out how to control that from London through the hub down to Yugoslavia or something. Pretty tough.
Right.
So it's systems thinking. That's what we got to do here.
I agree. I totally agree. So Susan, tell the audience how they can learn more about your work. I know you are on some social media channels, but tell people how to get hold of you.
Well, through you, because you do this. I'm terrible at social media. I just kind of work away. The website's there, Business Disability International, so you can reach us through that. Contact me directly. We're particularly looking now for allies on this artificial intelligence recruitment stuff. People who can give us examples of where it's working, where it's not, where companies that buy it have imposed conditions, where regulators are taking a fresh look. Because my dream on this is that, at the moment, if you feel that you've been treated unfairly through an AI interview for a job, all you can do is try to take them to court under rights, equality, human rights related legislation.
Right.
5 years later, and they're saying, prove it. How do you get them to open up the database stuff? I think it should be positioned as consumer protection, that just as you don't put a car on the market that would burst into flames, you don't put a product on the market that could deny or could condemn millions to long-term unemployment, that it would have to be licensed as safe in terms of the life chances of the people whose lives you're going to meddle with. And so if we look at the risk to life chances and get regulatory protection that says you have to have a license before you put it out, and if it turns out to be dangerous, the regulators can pull it. They don't require Debra to spend years proving something in a human rights tribunal. Both avenues should be open to us. And so if you've got anybody watching who can help me to build the argument, to put this under consumer rights, to just slow this down a little bit, it isn't going to go away, but it's happening so fast that I fear the retrofitting challenge is going to be humongous. So we need to
Yep. We're going to keep doing what we keep doing. We keep doing this. So, well, Susan, thank you so much for being on the show today. And thank you for all of your work over the years. I love partnering with you. And I really believe that you are adding great value to these conversations. So thank you for being on the show today.
Thank
So,
you.
bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.